Yo, welcome back for another video brought to you by Switch Gaming. Today we're doing a deck tech here with Mr. Andrew. Andrew, tell us a little bit, what are we doing here?
So this Legacy Hammer list, actually a pretty great entry point into Legacy as it doesn't require too many extra cards beyond the modern list. Basically the deck's trying to do the same thing as trying to establish an early board presence with Memnites and Ornithopters and maybe an Esper Sentinel for card advantage. And just plop a hammer on something. Give it +10/+10 and kill you. It still uses the same package as Sigarda's Pure Steel Paladin, and it has the same, actually a little bit better tutor package, debatably, as the Stoneforge Mystic. And instead of using Pure Steel, Steel Shaper's Gift, use Enlightened Tutor. Enlightened Tutor is a little worse because it puts it on top of the deck, but it's a little better because it's instant speed, and it also searches out enchantments. So where the modern deck can't find the Sigarda's this deck can. It also can put Urza Sagas on top of your deck. So
Ooh,
if you're getting in a
that's
little bit of a grindy situation, you can just start making constructs.
that's also pretty cool because let's say it could leave you door like you could potentially keep a one lander based off of a line tutor and just like go tutor up Saga for your second land.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then another feature this deck gets is it gets to play Arden Intrepid Archaeologist,
Ooh, what's
which is
that
kind of a
do?
unique card. A lot of Commander players will probably know it because it's one of the partner commanders from Commander Legends. But what it does is at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may attach any number of ores or equipments you control to target permanent or player.
Oh yeah, I remember playing against this in EDH once.
So what really cool thing you can do is you can enter the combat step and then trigger Arden's ability and target another one of your creatures. This promotes your opponent to respond. If they do not respond, you can attach any equipment onto the card. Not all of them, just any of them that are in play. Any one you want, any number you want. So if I have, let's say, an Esper Sentinel with a hammer on it already, but I have a Stoneforge Mystic that doesn't have a hammer on it, I can just equip a loose hammer over to the Stoneforge Mystic, but leave the other hammer on the Esper Sentinel. So it gives you a lot of flexibility with your equipping, which the modern list really doesn't have.
Mm-hmm.
It has a Pure Steel Paladin package, which is great, but it doesn't have anything beyond that once they're in play.
And that's just a combat trigger. You don't actually have to attack with the Arden, correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's just a beginning of combat trigger. You just go to the combat step and it triggers. And then you kind of get to just do your own thing. Um, the other thing that this deck gets to do, it's a little bit of a downside, because in Legacy, for those who don't know, Lurrus is banned, where in Modern it is not. Hence why we get to play stuff like Arden and Cauldron Complete. So you get to use these cards instead of the Lurrus for your Stoneforge Mystic. So you can use a true Stoneforge package in this deck with the Colossus Hammer, the Shadow Spear, the Cranial Plating, and the Cauldron. So you actually have real tutor targets that you can get. Where in the modern deck, you really can't play a Cauldron Complete because if you do, you sacrifice the Lurrus.
Mm-hmm.
And Lurrus is the best creature in modern, so why would you sacrifice that for a Cauldron that you might not be able to play?
Monkey argues with that, but here we are.
For sure. As far as lands go, it's just an upgrade to the modern package. You get to play Ancient Dens, they're artifact lands. They help with Metalcraft. For the Pure Steel Paladin, Mox Opal. Also, a big gain for playing Legacy. You get Mox Opal.
Yep.
You go 4 Ink Moth in this list. We're in the modern list. For those who know, I usually play 3 Ink Moths, and I play a one of copy of Hall of Heliod's Generosity to rebuy Sigarda's Aid. Um, in Legacy, you kind of just want to be lean, mean, and you gotta just kill people. And Inkmoth Next is pretty good because you can just also use it to trigger Metalcraft for Mox Opal if you need more colored mana. Also get Karakas, which for those who know Legacy, Karakas is one of the best things you could possibly be doing. It protects your Arden. It can bounce Merit Legias. It can do a whole lot. And then you get 1 Silent Clearing. You can really do any one Horizon land. I do Silent Clearing because it can work with Cranial Plating. You can bump that number up if you'd like by sacrificing maybe a Caracas or some planes. But really, your tutor package in this deck is already pretty solid. I don't think you're going to be needing to do that. And then, of course, staple of Modern and Legacy at this point, for Urza Saga. Card's just great. Kind of just works with every card in this deck and just really generates a lot of card advantage.
Okay, before we get into the sideboard, because I'm going to ask you like some of your plans and stuff for your matchups. Um, this is the main board you came up with. I like the silent clearing because it does synergize with the cranial plating. That was another thing. Did What was the reasoning for the cranial plating? Do you feel like cranial plating because we have opals and things of that nature that cranial plating is like the best thing you could be doing right now as an additional target, or was it a better consideration to just be playing the main board like a main board Jit one of or something like that? I'm just
Sure.
curious, like your reasoning behind it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I decided to do the cranial plating because cranial plating is good in all matchups for Metalcraft based decks. And you're absolutely right. It does synergize with Mox Opal, and it turns all any of your early game creatures into real threats. Which that was why Affinity was so powerful, was because all your creatures are threats. Cranial plating is still one of the most powerful equipment they've printed in recent memory. And when you're playing stuff like Ancient Den and Inkmoth Nexus, that also can count towards your artifact count as creatures, and even Urza Saga to make constructs. It can sheer number of artifacts in play can basically outrace any of the other equipment in your deck.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense.
As far as the sideboard goes, you know, really you base it on what it's really loosely based on what's around in the meta, what this deck's weak to. This deck's weak to combo. Um, any creature deck's basically weak to combo. So because of that, you have three Deafening Silence and the four Thorn of Amethyst. Thorn of Amethyst is just it's a great card, and if you're not really caring about casting your cards, and really in this deck, all your cards are so low converted mana cost, you're not worrying about that all too much. As far as the removal package goes, we have two copies of Portal Hole to help with Metalcraft, and obviously creating up plating and all that stuff. And also you can tutor it up with Enlightened Tutor. And two copies of Dispatch, which is probably the best one mana removal spell if you can enable it.
Yeah, and I would
Uh,
imagine you're able to do that quite easily in
Pretty
this deck.
easily in this deck, yeah. When you get so much artifact, synergies, you can pretty easily do that. Gravedigger's Cage in the list, Pithing Needle, these two cards, pretty obvious reasons. This one's for elves, and for like Reanimator.
And random
Pithing Needle is
grids,
good against
yeah.
control decks. Yeah. Relic, good against graveyard decks. You use Relic opposed to um, Soul Guide in this deck because I want to be able to protect my Colossus Hammers from surgical extraction.
Yeah,
So
no,
you're
that.
able to target yourself and then get rid of it.
Yeah, I think Relic is a better card in general.
And then the big card in the sideboard, Umezawa's Jit. Um, this card, was a legacy staple for a long time. Arguably could come into modern. It's kind of not really that great right now. But in this deck, it actually is pretty good because you can instant speed equip it with Sigarda's Aid, along with other things. And against creature magic decks, the Jit is still probably the best thing you can be doing. It can really swing games. Um, in games where the life total is a concern, Jit gets you there. In games where you're just chipping in and your opponent doesn't, they can't afford to block. Eventually, the Jit's just going to kill them because you can just buff your creature up or just wipe their board. So it's, I mean, still the first quote unquote planeswalker, and it's got a lot of synergy, especially in this deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like what I see. I'm a big fan of Dispatch. I've always enjoyed playing that card in artifact based decks. I've played it in many Urza builds and so forth, and obviously Affinity played that, which probably where you got your first taste of using the card. I'm assuming.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Portable Holite is a card that just recently it came out in the Dungeons and Dragons. So is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. This card is really big game. because it's target non-land permanent. So
Mm-hmm.
in Legacy, some of the non-land permanents you really care about are stuff like Null Rod. Null Rod's a big pain.
Yep.
And decks that play it are considered like Delver, mid-range decks, that sort of thing. And being able to just tutor it up with e-tutor and just play it is huge gain, huge gain. And typically, what's it called? Force of Will is not that good against this style of deck, where you're just trying to beat face in pretty early. 2 for 1 yourself is not something that you want to be doing. So typically, you're able to slam something down in the sideboard games.
Yeah. No.
And like we were saying, this is a great upgrade from Modern. It's really cheap. I think if I was to do the math, it would probably be sub 300. The big cost being the thorns, which you can play without those. But if you're talking main board, it's the 4 Mox Opals. But if you've been playing Modern a long time and playing Affinity, typically a lot of Hammer players have been playing a long time. That's where they got into it with Affinity. That's your big investment, along with some e-tutors.
And a couple
The lands are
Caracas.
pretty
Yeah.
cheap. Yeah. So, I mean, you're really not, you're looking at a pretty low investment cost into the format, which is a pretty sweet deal.
And what's super nice about it, the cards that you listed outside the Mox Opal, the rest transferred other decks pretty easily because Thorn is like a very big like sideboard staple in this format. I know I've played it in my sideboard a few times in different decks.
For
Um,
sure.
and Mox Opal actually goes pretty well. Like if for some reason this deck didn't work out, or let's say somehow this deck became very good and they act something, they just say no more hammer, right? Let's
Yeah,
hypotheticals.
Mox Opal in Legacy is one of those cards. It will always be there.
Yeah, I don't think.
Um,
But this is a different format. I don't think Mox Opal kind of thing, especially when you have other very powerful either mana rocks or we have the soul lands.
yeah, all the cards you're investing in for Legacy in this deck, just like you said, they do transfer to other decks. Mox Opal transfers to basically all the Urza decks, the artifact decks. Granted, those are a little bit higher investment cost in the format, but I mean, this if you are enjoying Legacy after you pick this deck up, maybe you do want to invest more money in Mox Opal. It's a great investment in the Legacy format. And as far as Caracas goes, Caracas is a staple legacy land. And quite frankly, it's not going anywhere, and the price isn't going to be going down.
Right.
And as far as Enlightened Tutor goes, Enlightened Tutor, it's in very niche decks in Legacy, but there is pretty safe investment because of the EDH format. Their price is stable on them; they're not going anywhere. Um, so if you do need to offload them for other cards, it's not usually that hard to do so.
No, for I agree with you 100% there. The deck actually looks pretty good. I like the additions to like Arden and the Alliant Tutors. Now, briefly, I want to talk to you about some matchups. Like I said, I'm a big fan of Portable Hole because a matchup I think that card would slot in pretty well with. Let's talk about the number one deck in the format. It's been the number one deck for no matter if people want to be in denial and say it isn't. Blue Red Delver. Uh,
Yeah, it's typically the decks I like to play actually have a pretty good matchup against Delver. I think this deck has a fairly good match against Delver. It pressures them, which the reason Delver's always been so good is because it's a low mana cost uh, deck that pressures your opponent significantly while holds up protection. While this deck, you place a Esper Sentinel and then just start playing threats. They have to answer it. They lose resources. And the minute Delver starts 2 for 1ing themselves consistently, you're usually in a pretty good spot. And landing a Cauldron Complete against Delver is almost game over. The only point of concern in that particular matchup would be sideboard games where Meltdown is an option. And for those who don't know what Meltdown is, it's a 1 mana Shatterstorm against all 0 mana artifacts. And then if you want to destroy more, you just commit more mana to it. So it scales to destroy all artifacts.
Yeah, no, Meltdown's really good. And that is probably like a card. I have been seeing that card on the Ryzen um recent list that I've been looking at. Obviously, I've been getting ready for the Legacy Pedal, and so I've been looking at a little bit closer to the format than I normally would. So if you're gonna go up against Blue Red Delver, just tell us what you're like right off of this list. What are you taking out and what are you bringing in?
The cards I'm definitely bringing in, I'm bringing in the dispatches and the portable hole. I'm probably going to be cutting probably the Arden. Arden's probably a little too cute in the matchup. You want to be a little bit lower to the ground, and I'd probably trim um, a Mox Opal and that's a tough one. Probably a Memnite. Memnites are pretty. Actually, I probably wouldn't even cut the Mox Opal. Yeah, I cut one Mox Opal and one Memnite. Memnite's pretty. Obviously it's a pretty good card, being a 0 mana 1/1. But when your opponent's creatures are all 1 mana 3/2s, 3/3s, definitely outscales it pretty fast. So actually, in rethinking my sideboard plan, I'd probably trim uh, 2 to 3. I'd probably trim two Memnites, one Arden, and one Mox Opal. And there's some argument to bring in the Jit, and if I was to bring in the Jit, I would cut the second Arden. And
Okay,
it really just emphasizes the equipment package.
yeah, that seems like a pretty clean plan. Because yeah, being able to disrupt them and in addition having that pressure to back it up, that's why they typically will have a bad matchup against like Burn, for example, because they can be like, hey, we'll get rid of one of your guys, like one of your threats that Delver have, potentially will have, and then they're just doing all these low to the ground spells, which you do similar like play style.
Yeah, and worthy of mention with Umezawa's Jit is in the Delver matchup. Really their biggest threat is going to be the Murktide region. And
Mm-hmm.
typically Murktide region is going to be a 6/6 to an 8/8. So by getting one hit with Jit and then just gaining 6 life, you're really kind of minimizing the amount of damage that is actually being dealt with that card.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a ton of sense. Um, So you got your Delver playing. You think that the matchup's actually pretty good for what you're for your kind of game plan. Let's
I
talk
think
about
game one is pretty solid. I think games two and three you can make an argument when they bring in a lot more removal.
right. No, that makes sense. Now there's also a deck that plays somewhat similar to Delver, and I think that deck is also on the rise, and that's like Bant Snow.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a little bit more of a trickier matchup. Reason being is it's a control deck, but it has a lot of just clean one for ones with prismatic ending. I think that actually would be a pretty bad matchup. Granted, you're pressuring them really early on, and if you can place enough pressure on them, the deck does fold pretty quickly. But if you get to turn three, turn four, and you really haven't started to turn a corner on them, then you're really going to be in a bad spot. It's one of the few decks in Legacy that really plays really a buttload of removal. They play 4 copies of the swords and 4 copies of prismatic ending, which is a clean answer to your entire deck. And you know, if you just give any control deck enough time, they will end up winning the game.
Very true. Very true. So what is going to be your sideboard game plan for that matchup?
I definitely think the four thorns are definitely in there. As far as other options you have, I think Grafdigger's Cage, it's not a great option, but I think it's fine. I think you could make an argument for that card, but really I'm more interested in the Relic, the Thorns, the Dispatches, and possibly the Cage. So I'm looking at a 7 to 8 card side out.
So you're going
As
to be
far as
taking.
cards siding out, it's probably going to be the tutor package, and it's going to be some number of Mox Opals and Springleaf Drums. Really don't need as much mana because I'm expecting the game to go a little bit longer. But I don't think you want to cut on any of the equipping effects. as you really just need to consistently be able to add pressure to your opponent. So probably, I'd probably cut one Mox Opal, two Springleaf Drums. That's three cards. Two Tutors, that's five. And probably trim two Memnites and possibly trim the Shadow Spear. I don't think I'm getting bigger than their cards. So that's eight full cards I could side out. The only argument would be if some lists are playing Field of the Dead. If Field of the Dead is in there, hammer decks are really bad against Field of the Dead. You need the Shadow Spear to kind of just have a clean answer to your opponent.
Yeah, they just block so effectively, right?
Right, exactly. Call to Complete's a nice alternative option if you don't want to do the Shadow Spear, as it does give the trample. But I do think you still, if you do see a Field of the Dead, it's definitely coming in.
Makes sense. We'll talk about one more matchup. So those are probably like two of the most popular decks. Let's talk about one, just a staple that in there. I think if you go to like a local, like actual Legacy paper tournament, you're probably gonna run into these kind of decks. And let's talk about like one of the land strategies. Let's just say, for example, something that's more accessible, but it's still like very good. Let's say Turbo Depths.
Turbo Debs, yeah, that's a pretty solid deck. I think this deck has pretty big game against them. Maybe not game one. Game one, Turbo Depths is, it's a combo deck. It's trying to assemble a 2020 as fast as possible. You do have some game by being able to block with Ornithopters, but really they just need to, if they assemble, are able to assemble a Merit Lage before you find a flyer, before you can 20 them, you're probably not going to be winning that game. But games two and three, you get a lot of options. You get Portable Hulls, you get Pithing Needle, you get Dispatch, all exceptional options in that matchup. Um, you can just kind of lock down a lot of their cards with just Pithing Needle. You can lock down Thespian Stage, lock down Vampire Hexmage, and Dispatch and Portable Hull are clean answers to uh, not only, well, Portable Hull is a clean answer to their hate because some of them do play Null Rod, but it also cleans up Merit Lage, and so does Dispatch.
Very true. And that's the name of the game. Like, if you're able to keep the Lage up. Post board, they could potentially have Talon Striker, but that seems like a poor plan because them trying to go the mid late game like that with you isn't going to go well for them.
Yeah, for sure. And there's also, a lot of people they concede a little too early against those lands decks. But this deck, because they just assemble a 2020 and you just lose. But this deck has Shadow Spear in the main, which is a big game because if you go above 20 life, Merit Lage can only deal 20. So if you can just get above that threshold, you're usually in pretty good shape.
This is true.
You can buy if you can buy yourself a attack off the Merit Lage, and they have to have another Merit Lage to survive an attack from you. You're usually doing pretty good.
Yeah,
So a lot these kind of decks, you just have to know your matchups.
yeah, and that comes with every
Every
format. I
aggro
think. Yeah,
strategy, yeah, every time because the aggro decks are typically going to have a high win percentage, but you're definitely going to have to work for your games two and three. It's easy to get your opponent sometimes, but once they bring in the hate, then you got to really work for it.
yeah. No, I think the deck looks pretty sweet. Like I said, I like the appeal to being able to transition over to Legacy. If you have like a local Legacy tournament, you have a copy of your Hammer deck laying around. You can easily like instead of having to go out and paying thousands of dollars for a potential new deck, you have this as an option to be your deck. What's also really cool that I like about this deck is it's just a good little combo. It has pressure a lot with like cards like Espresso that also interact with your opponent's doing where they could potentially let you draw cards. So now their removal spells get a little deflated.
Yeah, for sure. And one nice thing about this deck is the expensive part of Legacy is always the mana base, and it's got a pretty affordable mana base. Like so, even if you don't have a Hammer deck lying around, this might be an option that you want to get into, because a lot of these cards just go into other strategies. A lot of the lands do, which typically isn't the same for a lot of legacy decks where they need specific lands.
Right. But yeah, like I said, I think this deck looks pretty sweet. I can't wait for us to actually do some gameplay with it. There's a lot of cool things I could see. I'd like to like his name in the strong enough word. I would love to be able to see some matchups against like Blue Red Delver and maybe Death and Taxes. Those are two decks that I think are very popular right now. Death and Taxes is a little bit more popular, I think, in paper because that's similar to this deck. That deck is very accessible price wise. In Magic Legacy terms at least, because in Legacy terms, a $1,200, $1,300 deck is actually quite reasonable when the decks usually average 3,000 or more because of the land bases.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're absolutely right. I think you're going to definitely see decks that are a little bit more on the affordable end than seeing fully built Delver decks across your table.
Yep,
You will play against Delver, but you're probably going to be playing against some taxes or some lower end of the spectrum cost-wise decks.
yep, I agree 100%. But that's all the time we got today for this deck tech. Thanks, Andrew, for coming on and breaking down this deck that you put together. Like I said, we'll look forward to playing some matches with it.
Yeah, it'll be a good time.
Yep. But until next time, we'll catch you guys later.